Welcome to the White and Blue Podcast. I'm Doug Goodnow, and my co-host is Colleen McGinnis. We are here to tell the interesting stories of Hillsdale College alumni, more accurately, help them share their own stories. Here's a little bit about today's guest. Dr. Elizebeth Edwards Spalding is chairman of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and founding director of the Victims of Communism Museum. A lifelong educator and frequent public speaker, the 1988 graduate is senior fellow at the Pepperdine University School of Public Policy and visiting fellow at the Andel Graduate School of Government at Hillsdale College. She is the 2024 recipient of the college's Elizabeth Smith Friedman Freedom Award. Elizabeth, thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Doug and Colleen.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi.
All right. So Doug already mentioned that this year's second recipient of the Elizabeth Smith Friedman Freedom Award recipients. It's a mouthful to say. We're very honored and excited to give this to you. And we're excited about this award, too, because we think it really reflects Hillsdale in so many ways and the education here, but also honors such an important woman throughout our history and in the cause for freedom. And that leads us here today to you and to a number of things, but in particular, the work that you've done over your career, but more specifically with the Victims of Communism Museum in Washington, D.C. So I'd love to ask to start how that began. Maybe if you can share a little bit about the inception of that museum and your involvement there and how important it is, that'd be wonderful.
Well, the story is actually a lifelong story in some ways because I'm a third generation anti-communist and a native Washingtonian. So that's D.C., not West Coast.
Oh, I'm West.
Yes, that's good too. And so I grew up being concerned about this issue, about being for freedom and against the tyranny of communism. And 30 years ago, there was a unanimous act of Congress, which is, rare, that authorized the nonprofit that became the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And my father and somebody else were the co-founders of the organization. And so I heard about it a lot. And I was actually at the inception of the entire organization before the public law that was signed into law by President Bill Clinton at the end of 1993, because my parents and I were at a family brunch and after Mass one Sunday, and we were talking about how people were forgetting about the Cold War and about those people who had suffered behind the Iron Curtain, and then there were still people who were being repressed by communism in after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union in great numbers, around the world, 5 countries, including the People's Republic of China, and people were forgetting. And my mom at some point said, there should be something that memorializes the victims of communism. And my father took the napkin from underneath his coffee mug at Chadwick's on Wisconsin Avenue in Northwest Washington, and he took out his pen and he wrote Vic of Com Mem. And we don't have the napkin. We wish we had it now framed somewhere, but we don't. And that's when it all started. And then I was always very interested. I was studying things in grad school at the time and researching and starting to think about my dissertation. And it all ended up being connected to this issue. The Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation spent 15 years raising private funds to build the memorial on federal parkland in Washington, D.C., this memorial to the victims of communism, all the victims of communism. And President George W. Bush dedicated that on behalf of the United States to the victims of communism. I was there. My children laid the first wreaths at the memorial. So this was part of my family. Fast forward again, the board of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation invited me, 7-8 years ago to join. I did. First, I was made secretary, then I was made vice chairman. Now I'm chairman, and part of that overlapped with the organization. It's a nonprofit 501c3 finally raising not enough funds to keep it open, but enough funds to build a small museum. They didn't have enough funds, though, to cover the expertise of someone to do the content. And so it turned out that so many different things in my life, including Hillsdale, made me qualified to make this museum. And then you had the addition of COVID going on, and people were shut down, locked down, not in Hillsdale for the most part, but elsewhere this happened. And so I had a large iMac computer, thank God, and also the laptop and the iPad. And I started going to town with these design teams that VOC had already retained, and used, decades of learning and direct experience with people who had escaped from communism and were experts on communism to research and write the content of the museum. And then that extended to the film scripts, to many other visuals at the museum. And I worked with other academics, but I was the final say, the final writer, the final editor on everything that people see on the walls at the museum. So now I can say I've made a museum, but it was so many things coming together. And so sometimes you have to do something. And I felt like I was called to do this project.
Mm-hmm. By the way, as someone who recently was at the museum, it's spectacular, and the work you've done on it is just unbelievable, especially when I think you were the one that you wrote every single word, right? For
Pretty
that
much,
museum.
yes.
I would just say, if you get out to Washington, D.C., you have to check out this museum. I'd like to ask you, you talked about your family history with communism, but you've kind of lived that a little bit. Tell me a little bit about, your family embraced a lot of the refugees from communism. Tell me about those experiences.
Yes, Doug. So we're not ethnically a group that people will say, oh, your family got away or your grandparents got away in some way or something like that. But growing up as I did in a household I'm also a third generation conservative. So I grew up in this conservative, anti-communist, Catholic household just outside the line in Washington, D.C. And so my father and my late grandfather were, and so was my late grandmother, but anyway, they were all really committed anti-communists. So was my mom. And so it was in the water. It was something that from a very early age was important, or I thought it was important. At first I didn't even understand. I didn't understand that by learning, the first songs I learned, aside from church songs, were things like God Bless America, Hail to the Redskins. These are the songs, right? This is how I grew up. And so some of my earliest memories are of guests coming for dinner and long talks at the dinner table. And I thought it was normal until I realized from friends it wasn't, that you would meet people who had swum through shark-infested waters to get away from the People's Republic of China, or who had managed to get onto leaky boats to get away from Vietnam or Cuba, or had at night managed to get under barbed wire fence to get away from multiple places in Eastern and Central Europe. And so I would hear these stories, and I was there. I was part of learning from these people. And later on, I realized that's not everybody's story. And then that accompanied what I was reading on my own as I got a little bit older. And like many, I went through first that stage where I was reading everything I could find on World War II, both fiction and nonfiction. And then I realized, oh, there's this other totalitarianism, communism, and there were fewer books, especially for, young people and what we now call young adult reading. And so I read everything I could. And then all of this sort of lines up with the 1980s. And when I was in ninth grade, it was Campaign 80. So when you get called, you're the totalitarian by liberal high schoolers. And I was at a very good but very liberal public high school in Bethesda, Maryland. When you're getting called that, you want to know what that means. And when Reagan was being called, like a fascist, what does that mean? And I thought, no, we're gonna explain what things mean. And I was often I was the only person. I rarely had anybody on my side. So that was part of it carrying into the teen years. But it all started with meeting those witnesses, those people who got away from communism. And I knew what our republic, what a liberal democracy was for. And I also knew what I was against as a result. And I knew what communism, totalitarianism in general, but communism did and does.
So you mentioned a couple words that we hear today a lot, misused.
Yes.
Fascist being one of them.
Right.
So since then, and now you talked earlier about how important it is to not forget. Can you kind of share why it's so important not to forget and what freedom means? I mean, what the distinction is for those who are maybe not getting the kind of education and childhood that you had.
That's right. Yeah, Colleen, I think part of this is we have to keep defining the for and the against. So we know, what we should understand, what we're blessed by, as we say in the Declaration, nature and nature's God, and then we built out in the best experiment yet, the United States of America. And I think that is important to understanding the regime. So, to bring in Hillsdale a little bit already, it wasn't like I didn't kind of know what a regime was before I got to Hillsdale, but that was a major part of my education as a politics major, and it came up in history all the time, the history classes too, philosophy classes. And so this is something where you have to know the positive part and the substance and the principles that are permanent and real and true, and then what that means, what it should look like in a form of government, what it should look like in our institutions, what it should look like in how it should open the space for civil society, including everything from churches to neighborhoods. And all of that is so very important to know, because that's what freedom is. Freedom is not just the license to do whatever you want. I mean, a Hillsdale audience knows this. Liberty and law have to work together. They are mutually dependent. And freedom is ultimately choosing what is right and having that freedom, having that ability to do that and make the right choices, to be prudent, as we would also say in the Hillsdale vernacular. And then to know that there have been times throughout human history where they're not forms even, they're perversions of rule that have come along to challenge that. And one of the first things they do, and totalitarianism, including communism, does this, is they try to change man. They try to change human nature. They try to remake that, which doesn't work. It never works. But that's the beginning of them taking away freedom, not understanding what we are as human beings and by nature. And then they set up an entire system of state and society, because totalitarianism, including communism, always joins that. There's no, the Tocquevillian mediating institutions and everything else. None of that exists, or it's so severely repressed in totalitarian societies that people have to go underground. The spirit of resistance stays alive because that's human nature. That's in human nature. And the totalitarians, including the communists, try to stomp it out, try to get rid of it. And ultimately they can't. But for a long time, they are able to sustain themselves, especially if they get all the mechanisms of power. That's why power is important. We have to understand correctly how to use power, but also how it gets used by communists and other totalitarians. And they are trying to upend everything about human nature, about the regime, about government, about what we are at the individual level, at the family level, at the community level, at the country level. And we could do seminar on this, mm-hmm. but that I think would help people get into the space of how to think about this so that they can make a defense of what is true and what is real freedom, right? Mm-hmm. And also so that they can analyze and pick apart and say, ultimately, it's not even an alternative. Harry Truman, the first president to handle the Cold War, he said there are these alternative ways of life. And he was right. And he also said, the second one is not freely chosen. And that's part of the freedom aspect here too. We need to be free to choose, to quote something that is also well known to a Hillsdale audience. And that means understanding freedom, but then having the ability to do it ultimately in the United States as a citizen, right?
Okay, we're going to take a break and we'll be right back with the White and Blue podcast.
Hey, it's Scott Bertram, and I've got a challenge for you today. Become a better educated American citizen. And to help you do just that, we at Hillsdale College have our free online courses available for all who wish to learn. Our challenge? Take just one of our courses. There are so many to choose from. You can discover the beauty of the Bible in the Genesis story, study the writings of C.S. Lewis, or explore the true meaning of America in Constitution 101. We have dozens more to choose from, and all these self-paced free courses feature Hillsdale faculty and scholars, many you've heard on this podcast. So visit hillsdale.edu/course, COURSE, and pick one of the more than 30 free Hillsdale courses. I hope you'll accept my challenge. Pick whichever course you like and become a more educated citizen today. Go to hillsdale.edu/course, COURSE. That's hillsdale.edu/course.
Now it's time for the Hillsdale History Minute, where we bring a slice of Hillsdale College history to the White and Blue podcast. Have you ever heard the phrase, "You may fire when you are ready, Gridley"? Hillsdale College alum and U.S. Navy Captain Charles Gridley earned a place in history on May 1st, 1898, during the Battle of Manila Bay. During the battle, Commodore George Dewey gave Gridley the famous command, "You may fire when you are ready, Gridley," that started the battle. After attending Hillsdale, Gridley was appointed to the U.S. Naval Academy in 1860. He was stationed on the only U.S. Navy ship based on the Great Lakes at the time, the Michigan, at Erie, Pennsylvania. In 1897, he was assigned to command the USS Olympia, Dewey's famous flagship. At the conclusion of the battle, it was discovered that Gridley had been suffering from dysentery and what was likely liver cancer. After that battle, Gridley left his command because of health and died en route to the U.S. in Kobe, Japan. His memorial service was held at St. Peter's Episcopal Church in Hillsdale on July 31st, 1898, and attracted more mourners than the church could hold. After his death, a monument to Gridley was erected in Erie, Pennsylvania, and placed in Gridley Park. 4 ships in the U.S. Navy have been named for him. One other special honor is a seashell that was included on the college's coat of arms in recognition of Gridley's heroism at the Battle of Manila Bay.
All right, so Elizabeth, it seems this is not my area of expertise for sure, but in my experience, obviously, as a Hillsdale alum too, understanding human nature is a big part of the education and the foundation at Hillsdale. It seems like communism has persisted throughout our history, our human history, and continues today, because in what I can tell anyway, it's a fault of human nature, and so it's something I think it seems like we'll probably continue to battle, unfortunately. But how in your world has education played into your understanding of what it means to be free?
Excellent question. I think that it is central to how I have taught. I've been teaching undergraduates, and in the last 5-6 years, more and more master's students between the Pepperdine School of Public Policy and their scholars program, and then the Hillsdale Master's Program in Washington, D.C. And with the undergraduates for all the decades before, it was a mix of students, very few conservatives, but a few, And it was mostly students that are more formed a different way, not a Hillsdale way. And so helping generations of students, because another thing about this is that when I started, I was the same generation as my students. And then we get older as we're teaching and they move along. So somewhere in the late millennial period, how students would understand human nature, even there were always political differences among the students, but it was closer to what a real understanding of human nature was earlier in my career. And then this has changed with so many, we don't have time here, but so many other things that have changed in politics and society, culture. And so I had to learn to talk about this and try to tap into, what does freedom mean? And a lot of the time in the middle years, I guess I'd say, the students were still more about, it's whatever I want. It's license. It feels good. That's my understanding of freedom. But in more recent years, we have undergraduates especially thinking more that they don't even know. I don't even know that they can define freedom in a way, because so many things have been presented to them, imposed on them, and feelings have replaced reason. And it doesn't mean, we're human beings, so part of being human being is having feelings, emotions. I'm not anti feelings and emotions, but if we're gonna be fully human, then we've been given this amazing gift of reason, and it should be right reason, and that's what we're supposed to tap into, develop over time through practice, through experience, right? And so that's what so many undergraduates, I would say, and probably K-12 too, are not getting in various schools. And so we have to figure out almost a new language to talk with them about what freedom actually means. And it means conveying to them many things that we've already talked about somewhat philosophically, but also practically. I encourage, and I'm teaching fewer of these students these days, but I'm encouraging them to take risks, because so many of them just value being safe over everything else. And so much of what's going on now on campuses on fire is having to do with it is a Marxist element, and I don't mean that in some alarmist way. It's just ideologically that is present. But then you couple that with a generation of students that have been told it's your feelings, not what's real, and then you're always guaranteed being safe and validated by what you feel, even if that means then somebody else can't express themselves or do anything else, not just use their words, but do anything. And so that's where we are right now. And it makes for a challenge in education. I am fortunately at this place now where I can choose what I want to teach. And so the master's students at Hillsdale are tremendous, and there are gaps. They want to have a Hillsdale education, but I don't have to make the initial defense on here's what freedom means.
Right.
So then you can really get into the teaching. Whereas my Pepperdine students, much more of a mix. And so for them, I have to almost talk different ways to different students. But you keep returning to, as you get to know a particular student, you might even tailor what you're saying to that student.
Well, as the Elizebeth Smith Friedman Freedom Award recipient, talk to me a little bit about what that means. And, we started that award last year and felt like for the first living recipient of the award, another Elizebeth would be a perfect choice. And obviously our interview here kind of proves that. So tell me what that award means to you.
Well, I am so honored to be the first living recipient of the Elizebeth Smith Friedman Award. And I knew of her, but not well. And I read up on her because I am an academic, so I can't help myself. And I was excited what I learned, but also I grew in my admiration for her as I learned more about her. And I would like to think, even though she's a 1915 graduate, as I recall.
Yes.
So I would like to think that we would have been friends I could have been an English major. I was courted at one point, but I ended up as a politics major. Mm-hmm. We would have had a lot in common, I think. She wrote for the Collegian, so we would have had that in common. And I would like to think that we would have quote unquote hung out and done some work on behalf of truth and freedom and truth. You cannot separate those two, and that we would have done things together on behalf of freedom. So I think it's an aptly named award. I also think the fact that she worked for so many years at so many important things and often didn't get credit. It wasn't known fully what she was doing. I really admire that because I think so many of us end up doing hard work every day and don't get noticed, or sometimes somebody else actually gets the credit. I also think the fact that she put her children, her husband and children first, is very important. And it doesn't mean that she still didn't crack codes and do other important work, but she knew what was most important. And so I think she's an excellent role model. And Colleen mentioned earlier, a woman. I'm going to go ahead and say that. This is fabulous. And she is somebody that everybody should know about. She should be a household name, and not just for a Hillsdale audience. And so I'm very, very honored to be receiving this award. And I'll share an anecdote. I got to meet the WIP students several times this semester. And as some of you know, my husband is an employee of the college, and he's the dean and VP, vice president in Washington, D.C. for Hillsdale. And so we have the students over at least once a semester, and we always do an end of the semester dinner party. And we had that last week. And so the spring group is, and it was Washington weather that worked. So we had everybody outside. We're sitting at a long table. The students are all trading stories. And I was actually seated next to the incoming editor of the Collegian. Lovely girl, lovely young woman. And she's a lovely young woman. And she was asking about the Collegian back in the day. But also, I think it was Matthew, my husband, who said, well, you're sitting next to the Elizabeth Smith Friedman awardee for this year. And she said, oh my gosh, you're living.
Oh, no.
And she said, this is great.
A living legend.
Yeah, but she knew that last year was the inaugural award, and obviously was given appropriately to Elizabeth Smith Friedman, but that it was a posthumous award. And so it was just funny to have her put it that way. And then she wanted to know, and she said, well, I know you've done a lot of things, but this must be really, also for Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and the museum. And then a couple others said, I went and saw your museum. And so it was all very edifying, but it kind of wrapped it all together, especially because I knew we were coming up to Hillsdale the next week.
So that's a great story. And I bet those are the kinds of memories as a student that they'll have forever, those little blips in your 4-year experience. Somewhat of a segue. So you've had a successful career so far since you graduated in '88, and you're a scholar, a teacher on boards. And then this work, which is extensive with the museum, was all done pro bono. Mm-hmm. And you're a wife and a mom. Mm-hmm. So maybe tell us how you've been able in such wonderful ways to balance all of that.
Right. Well, some of it, speaking as a conservative woman of faith, some of it goes back to choices I made, including before I was married. And I was interested in using my talents. I knew I was put on earth somehow to teach. I've always been like that, even since I was little. And my sister it has sent over the years, her kids are all older now, but a couple of times when she had a late talker, she'd just send them for a weekend to visit, and the kid would be talking by the time he or she went back home. So I'm meant to teach, but I at one point was very interested in various things in government or in journalism. I went through that period that everybody does where you think, should you study law? And I realized at Hillsdale that I wanted to do graduate work, and I was encouraged by a number of professors to do so. And at that point, it was to keep the door open for a couple of different things, maybe teaching or government. But I fell in love with teaching through the teaching assistant, the TA experience in graduate school, as some people do. And so I thought, this is something I can do if I'm also have the vocation to be, a wife and mother, and have something that, since we live in a day and age where, as we always talk about, we don't have to go down to the river and wash our clothes there, right? We have great things that automate. Yep, exactly. Things that give us our conveniences in life. So, and then when I got married, I was building my teaching career. Kids came. But a big part of this is also my husband was always willing to help. My late mother, my parents are local, my dad still is. And so anyway, she would help. Friends would help. You would help them. They would help you. And so it's something that, especially talking to young women, they often seek me out because they see me as somebody who's achieved balance in a good way. And I always say the important thing is, how are you made? What are your strengths and talents? That's where you're going to, focus, and God will make it clear what you're supposed to be doing, even when you don't know what you're supposed to be doing. And you just move forward, right? And you'll be used.
Yes. That's very encouraging to me. I was listening this morning to the audio transcripts, I guess you could say, of the video interview for your upcoming video, and it was fabulous. But one thing that you said that I loved was that in amidst all of these things throughout your life, and there's been a lot, that you always had a priority of keeping, or had a priority of keeping people first.
Yes.
And I thought that was really special and a great, simple but impactful lesson, or
that's right. I mean, many people will achieve many things, but I've always been one of those people for a variety of reasons, but just sort of socially, personally, when I'm old, who am I hanging out with? Am I hanging out with the accomplishments, or am I hanging out with the people, if I get to live to be old? But you will never regret putting people first. And it starts obviously with the people closest to you. And I'm very good. There are times people who are farther away will fall out of touch with each other, and it happens both ways. But if you put somebody in my orbit, that person is first. And they'll have needs. I mean, they'll have things that they can do too, but there will always be, and it's always something that you get more back from.
Awesome.
Well, speaking of the people, you've been connected to Hillsdale College, obviously as a student, but for a long time now as an academic, and now a parent. You have a daughter here who's going to be graduating.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about that. And again, your connections to Hillsdale College. And we can talk about the collegiate stuff too, if we want.
Yeah. So our daughter, Catherine, is graduating this year on Saturday. And she has had an excellent experience at Hillsdale, everything I could have hoped for her and more. And she turned in her final paper last night, I think. She took her final, as she called it, early yesterday morning. She met us at local eatery after the 8 a.m. exam.
That's the Palace Cafe for the older Hillsdale College
Aren't
Chargers.
you excited? I actually remembered this time. I almost said Palace Cafe. I have to think first. Is there going to be a glitch? Am I going to call it the wrong thing? And so she had eggs. No, she did. What did she have? I can't remember now. Anyway, she had her coffee. She had her coffee because caffeine is her friend. But I think she's done today. So that's exciting. And what's interesting about that is when she was little, she really wanted to go to Hillsdale. Then she realized, then Matthew started working for the college, and she's like, oh my gosh, that's his thing now. And she went through a period where she wasn't so interested. Then I said to her, oh, they have these summer programs. And
Smart move.
Yes. And also she went on two. They invited her back, but they liked her so much. But the first one she went on going into, was that 11th grade, I guess, was with Tom Connor. And it was that World War II class. And I had Tom Connor. And he was one of, yes,
Legend.
I figured. So
He's coming over for dinner tonight.
Excellent. Please say hi. Please say he has to look for me. I want to talk to him. So he was one of the most important professors. I mean, I had multiple very important professors to me when I was here at Hillsdale, but I knew that he was winding down, right? I couldn't believe that he was even thinking about retiring. And so I said to Catherine, I know you're not sure about Hillsdale, but you've got to take this course. And she had never been to either England or France. And she loves World War II. She wrote the Catholic girls' school she went to. She wrote her senior thesis on prisoners of war, including from World War II. So she ends up going on this. Well, she comes up here. She takes the class here. Then they travel, and then she comes back and she says, "Oh my gosh, is every history professor like Dr. Connor? And I want to go to Hillsdale." And she changes. So anyway, she ends up at Hillsdale. She has this fabulous, well-rounded experience. She makes the best friends. They're wonderful, wonderful people. I'm so grateful that she's had such good friendships the way that I did. And then she's close to these professors. She refers to them almost like rock stars. You can imagine. And so it's been a great, great experience. And the challenge, I guess, for Matthew, as he said, he used to be able to rely on the comment that he was married to the most important alum of Hillsdale College. And now he has to adjust his language because the two most important women in his life are now going to both be alumni, as long as Catherine does get to graduate on Saturday.
I think there's a pretty good chance.
That's a great change. So then how did you end up at Hillsdale?
That's an interesting story, I suppose, maybe not to everybody, but so at the time, I graduated from high school in 84. And at the time I was looking at colleges, Hillsdale was known as a conservative college, but it wasn't as well known as it is now nationally. And so I went to, as I referred to, this very liberal, prestigious public high school. And so when I started mentioning the list, everybody would share their lists. It was that kind of school. Where are you applying? All that kind of stuff. And I would throw in Hillsdale with the other schools I was applying to, and you'd get the blank face, like I've never heard of it. They would get the name wrong when they repeated it back to you. And so I came up for a merit weekend, and I met some of the people, including John Wilson. Probably Tom Paine was in that interview, but Tom Connor could have been. There were 6 of them. I can't remember. Anyway, I did meet professors I then took classes from and learned so much from that very weekend. And for me, I thought, this is fantastic. You get one-on-one teaching and attention from really smart people, and you get to study all of these amazing subjects. And then also that weekend involved staying in the dorms. I had a hostess. She was lovely. We ended up becoming friends. When she was a junior and I was a sophomore, we roomed together in Waterman.
Oh, wow.
So it's the kind of thing where I was making friendships already when I was here. I was at a very large public high school. I actually liked that Hillsdale was small because I thought small classes, that's what I want for learning. And then I started to realize that learning about a different section of the country, because also Hillsdale was it was national, but it was more regional than it was now. And I can still run them all together. Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, right? Wisconsin, but less so when I was here. But anyway, these are the places I went home for weekends because I couldn't go home. So somebody would invite you home. So I had that as an experience too. And when it came down to, and I needed scholarship. So I did get the merit scholarship. And at that time, my parents were going through horrible financial duress. So I didn't want to go into great debt. I figured God gave me a brain. I shouldn't have to. And so I was looking at the scholarship offers. And the other scholarship offers were, one of them was also a full scholarship, but it didn't go up with inflation. Whereas Hillsdale's was a full tuition scholarship. And then the place that I thought about that would have been different would have been Barnard. And I loved the idea of going to New York. So the fact that I was interested in a different place.
Completely different.
But it was completely different, right. But it also would have been going to a different place. And so, but Barnard was very expensive, and it was like a, part scholarship, whatever it was. So anyway, Hillsdale, for a variety of reasons, both conviction and what it would offer, but also then it made it possible for me to come here. And then, you can really immerse yourself in so many things here. I'm very grateful for the activities I got to do too, getting to Collegian.
All of us, are Collegian alums here, and we talked about
the editor.
Two editors here. I was a lowly sports editor, but Elizebeth and I shared the Computronics system, which at the time was state of the art, but it was a disaster on many fronts. And the college owes us, I think, a debt for keeping the Collegian going during that time.
Absolutely.
Were you on the Collegian together?
I think we just missed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, 88, 90. I see that.
I was a 90 grad,
But you overlapped. No.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
no.
I was editor in 87, so you were probably just starting to write.
Yeah.
88, I think, is when I came on under Greg Bailey as the editor. And Dave Ragukas my senior year.
Yes.
Very good memories, but not very good memories when it comes to working on putting the paper together on a computerized system that...
It was at the very beginning of all of this, and I think one of the frustrations, there were many, but one of the frustrations was we were told it was going to be automated, electronic, easier, right? We were promised easier, but you would still be there before you had to drive the paper down to the printer, and you're cutting to make things fit on the page because it still didn't print out the way it could. And, you were still using your X-Acto knife. You were still all the things that you probably don't know.
No, we sent
do you know what an X-Acto knife is?
Yes, I do. We did. We sent our files to a printer in Adrian. That was that. I was still up all night, though, once a week.
Right.
All night long.
We were the trailblazers for all of the modern technology. And I like to
take... somebody had to have a car. Somebody still had to have a car.
Yeah.
We were driving at dark 30.
Yes, my time was like 3 a.m. to put the sports section together. So good times.
So I'd love to know, it sounds like your father was passionate about the similar subjects.
That's right.
And how does he feel about your work and this award?
He's very proud. I don't think he's going to be able to come for the award, but he is coming for Catherine's graduation. So he and my son are flying up tomorrow, and they'll be with us for the weekend. He's looking very much forward to all of the activities, not just graduation. And our daughter's a Kappa Kappa Gamma, so she's a Kappa. And my dad, who was in a fraternity when he was undergrad at Duke, he just thinks it's marvelous that he's going to brunch at the sorority house on Saturday. So, but he is very proud of me. He's proud of the award. One of the very rewarding things about following in his footsteps in some way is that we have been able to work together. He is founding chairman of the Organization of Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. He still serves as a trustee. And my mother died in November 2022, and my dad lives close by. And so I'm basically his person. We see each other frequently, and we talk about things other than VOC, but it is something that we have in common. And so I get to have the benefit of his experience. And for him, he grew up in an anti-communist household, but for him, it was very personal. When he was a student after a stint in the Army, he went to Paris. He thought he was going to, write the great American novel on the left bank. And but one of the things that happened when he was there, he did work on his writing. As he says, he also worked on his drinking. But the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 happened when he was 24 years old or however he was at that time. And he said he couldn't believe how inspiring it was, and he really thought that the Hungarians were going to overthrow the government permanently. And then the fact that it got crushed almost 2 weeks. People forget how long, or they never learned how long the Hungarian Revolution was in 1956. And so when it was crushed and the tanks went in, and he saw that the West didn't help, that the Austrians said, come over the bridge if you can make it. They did help people who were fleeing, but that the West, NATO, the United States didn't help. And he thought that was a moment where you really could have helped change and overthrow communism, because the people on the ground were resisting and doing so much of it themselves. And that stuck with him. And so he really believes in, he co-founded VOC, but that's part of what he passed on to me. And he didn't know about Elizebeth Smith Friedman, but we've talked about her since then. And he says, oh, you're so deserving. This is so wonderful. I even told him the story about how her name's got the E in the middle rather than the A, and why her mother, I don't know if all of this is true, what I researched online, but apparently her mother didn't want her name shortened to Eliza. So that's why Elizebeth Smith Friedman has that spelling of Elizabeth. And so Dad, oh, and you've not shortened your name either. This is great. So he was finding all sorts of things that he thought were really great about it.
Wonderful. Well, you're a true inspiration.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Colleen.
Thanks for being here with us.
Yeah, we're very honored you could make the time and share your story.
It's been great to be with you, both of you. And I'm very, again, humbled and proud of this. And thank you for inviting me to be on your podcast.
Thank you.
It's our pleasure.
For Colleen McGinnis, this is Doug Goodnow thanking you for joining us on the White and Blue Podcast. And may that spirit long remain.